2 hours ago, Iranian state television confirmed that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran for 36 uninterrupted years, was dead, killed alongside his senior advisors, members of his own family, and at least 48 top Iranian officials, including the IRGC commander, the defense minister, and the national security chief, killed in a joint American-Israeli airstrike in an operation the Americans codenamed Epic Fury. Killed while Mark Carney was standing at a podium in Mumbai, India, in the middle of a trade mission to Asia, thousands of miles from Ottawa, thousands of miles from Washington, thousands of miles from Tehran. And what Carney said from that podium in Mumbai in the hours after the strikes began and in the hours after Khamenei's death was confirmed is the story that Washington did not see coming and that changes everything about the diplomatic geometry of this war. Because Carney did something that almost no Western leader outside of the United States and Israel was willing to do. He supported the strikes, clearly, publicly, and without qualification, saying Canada supports the United States, acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security, calling Iran the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East, reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself, and doing all of this from a trade mission to India while simultaneously telling reporters that Canada was not party to the military build-up or planning, and would not participate militarily in the conflict, a position so precisely calibrated that it stunned foreign policy analysts in Ottawa, London, Brussels, and Washington simultaneously, because here is the context that makes Carney's statement so significant and so strategically consequential. Because for the past 14 months, the defining story of North American geopolitics has been the trade war between Trump and Canada, tariffs, border restrictions, asset freezes, ultimatums, Alberta separatist meetings, Gordie Howe Bridge threats, the entire escalating confrontation between the two neighbors that had left Washington and Ottawa in the most hostile bilateral relationship since the War of 1812, and then on February 28, 2026, Trump launched the most consequential military operation of his presidency against Iran, and the first major Allied leader to publicly back him was not the United Kingdom, not France, not Germany, not Australia. It was Mark Carney, the man Trump had been trying to bully into submission for over a year, the man who had been redirecting Canadian oil to Asia and cancelling American federal contracts and building alternative trade alliances with the European Union and India specifically to reduce Canadian dependence on American markets, the man who had publicly told Trump that Canada does not negotiate under threat and that those days are over, and that man walked to a podium in Mumbai and said Canada stands with the United States on Iran, and the question that every diplomat in every capital is now asking is why. And the answer requires understanding three things simultaneously. First, that Canada's relationship with Iran is not abstract or theoretical, because on January 8, 2020, Iran shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight PS752 shortly after takeoff from Tehran, killing all 176 people on board, including 85 Canadian citizens and permanent residents, the largest loss of Canadian life in a single incident since the 1985 Air India bombing, and Canada has never received accountability, never received a credible explanation, never received justice for those 85 Canadians whose families have spent 6 years demanding answers from a regime that first denied responsibility, then admitted it was accidental, then stonewalled every investigation, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said it directly when he backed the strikes. Tehran shot down a plane full of Canadians and tried to build nuclear weapons to annihilate our allies, words that resonated across Canada in a way that transcended partisan politics. Second, that Canada had already designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist entity, had already sanctioned 256 Iranian entities and 222 individuals, had already cut off formal diplomatic relations with Iran in 2012 under Stephen Harper, and never restored them under Justin Trudeau, meaning Carney's position was not a sudden reversal, but a natural extension of a Canadian foreign policy consensus that had existed for over a decade across multiple governments of different political stripes. And third, that Carney's statement was not unconditional because he simultaneously called on all parties to protect civilian lives, said Canada was not party to the military planning, ruled out any Canadian military participation, and drew a careful distinction between supporting the goal of preventing Iranian nuclear weapons, aka sound endorsing every tactical decision made in Washington and Tel Aviv, a distinction that former diplomats and foreign policy scholars immediately noticed and that the NDP's foreign affairs critic immediately attacked, with Alexandre Boulerice calling it blind support for a dangerous venture and demanding that Canada be a voice for diplomacy and peace. While former Liberal Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy wrote in the Toronto Star that Carney's position exposed a fault line at the heart of Canadian foreign policy by invoking international law against adversaries while abandoning those same rules when Americans do the bombing, a critique that national security scholar Wesley Walk sharpened by noting that what Canada said it supported, preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, was not actually what Trump had said the American objective was, because Trump said the objective was to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats and to create conditions for the Iranian people to take their government into their own hands, language of regime change rather than denuclearization, meaning Canada publicly backed an operation whose stated American objective was broader than the objective Canada said it was endorsing, and now with Khamenei confirmed dead and the Iranian succession process underway, with an untested interim leadership council attempting to maintain authority over IRGC units and proxy forces across 6 countries while the country remains under active bombardment, the question of what Canada's carefully calibrated position actually means in practice becomes impossible to avoid, because if Iran retaliates against Canadian interests, Canadian diplomatic missions, or Canadian nationals in the region, Canadian staff in Tel Aviv have already been asked to relocate. Queen's University students were stranded in Doha after Iran's attacks closed regional airspace. Canadians in Iran were urged to shelter in place. Carney's statement of support for the American operation becomes a statement of alignment in a conflict Canada said it would not join militarily. And if the conflict escalates into the full regional war that analysts are now modeling, with Iran's proxy forces in Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen activating simultaneously and Gulf states absorbing Iranian missile fire while trying to decide how deeply to commit to American operations, Canada's position of verbal support without military participation becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as a coherent posture. And if the operation succeeds in accelerating regime change in Tehran, and the Iranian people do take their government into their own hands, as Trump urged, Carney's early and clear support positions Canada as a partner in whatever reconstruction and normalization process follows, rather than a bystander who hedged while the outcome was uncertain, which is the calculation that every Western government is now making in real time, and the Iranian-Canadian diaspora, whose reaction was described as jubilation by a Liberal member of Parliament and as genuine celebration of a possible turning point by community leaders, adds a domestic political dimension to Carney's position that makes the calculation even more complex, because those 85 Canadians who died on Flight PS752 have families who have waited 6 years for accountability and who are watching this week's events with a mixture of grief, hope, and the complicated feeling of watching the regime that killed their loved ones facie consequences it has never faced before. And 2 hours ago, the man who has spent 14 months as Trump's most effective opponent in the entire world stood in Mumbai and said Canada supports what America is doing in Iran. Not because Trump asked him to, not because the trade war is over, not because the Gordie Howe Bridge dispute is resolved, not because the Alberta separatist meetings have been forgiven, but because on this specific question, on this specific regime, on this specific threat, Canadian foreign policy and American military action arrived at the same place for the first time in a very long time. And what that means for everything that comes next, the trade war, the CUSMA negotiations, the bilateral relationship that was at its lowest point in a century just 72 hours ago, nobody in Washington or Ottawa has had time to calculate yet. Consequences it has never faced before. And 2 hours ago, the man who has spent 14 months as Trump's most effective opponent in the entire world stood in Mumbai and said Canada supports what America is doing in Iran. Not because Trump asked him to, not because the trade war is over, not because the Gordie Howe Bridge dispute is resolved, not because the Alberta separatist meetings have been forgiven, but because on this specific question, on this specific regime, on this specific threat, Canadian foreign policy and American military action arrived at the same place for the first time in a very long time. And what that means for everything that comes next, the trade war, the Kuzma negotiations, the bilateral relationship that was at its lowest point in a century just 72 hours ago, nobody in Washington or Ottawa has had time to calculate yet. Not because the trade war is over, not because the Gordie Howe Bridge dispute is resolved, not because the Alberta